Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, 6 Factors to Consider Before Choosing Tools to Secure Enterprise Mobility. First, some notes. Everyone is on mute today. The presentation is being recorded, so a replay link and a copy of the slides will be emailed after the webinar. The webinar is hosted today by Brett Cooper and Richard Makerson. Richard is the CEO of BlueFletch and has been in technology and mobility for nearly 2 decades. Richard is a sought-after resource for media and speaking. Brett is the founding partner of BlueFletch and also has been in the tech and mobility industry for over 20 years with companies like Coca-Cola and Accenture. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Richard and Brett.
Thanks for joining us again. I got Richard Makerson and myself here. And today we're going to talk about, this is an interesting one, but the how to choose the right tools for enterprise mobile security. I know, Richard, we were sort of joking about this before, the question of what is the best car to buy and why?
Right. You know nothing about my family. Do I have parents living with me? Do I have kids? Do I have a dog? Are we active? Does it snow? Just, tell me the best car and why. Go.
What am I going to end up with? Toyota Camry.
A gray Camry.
Camry.
Or a white Camry from the West Coast.
White Camry, got it. Or Florida where it gets hot. All right, so the things, I guess just to frame this a bit, one of the things we were talking about was, in the enterprise, to your point, what are the questions you have to ask to yourself, or you actually have to go through and evaluate to figure out what are the metrics or the variables that are involved in picking your tools or your tool set. So for us, I guess the first one was, what are your device types? And so tell me a bit about that, or walk that back for me a little bit.
Yeah, so that's helpful. So you need to know what people are going to be using. So mobile is a very broad term now. So is it actually mobile devices or is it laptops? And if it is mobile devices, are they BYOD devices? Are they corporate-owned personal use? Are they specific, rugged devices that are shared, like pooled devices? Now you can manage devices at the edge. So are you managing printers, IP cameras, sensors? So knowing which devices you're going to use and how you want to manage them is the first step for me.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the iOS versus Android. It's probably the biggest question we get, which is another can of worms to open up. I guess one of the other things around that is the second area we talked about, which is pretty important to think through, is security posture. Like, what is your security posture? And when you think about that question, what are the things you will typically ask or look for around just security and how people want to have? We term it as posture.
Yep. So it's, is there a hill that legal and your chief security officer, is there a hill that they've already determined that they were going to die on? And so, what risk are you comfortable having? Depending on the industry, like it can change. What you may see in retail is a little different than what you would see in logistics, especially if you're working for an airline at an airport, which is very different that you would see from something that's highly regulated, like utilities or healthcare. So understanding the security posture and the risk profile of the organization is, a great next step.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is locality. So in Europe,
Yep.
Europe you have much different standards. California, which is probably worse than Europe, and sorry, Californians. But I think a lot of the policies that are being put in place definitely have impacts on what you have to do. I think, like the phrase, the hill you have to die on. The third area we talked about was application landscape, and for me, the app landscape, I always think about it start out like, what are your apps doing? But for you, like, when you think about app landscape, what comes to mind? I know you're probably more on the developer tech side than I am.
Yes. So, being responsible for putting the applications out there, when you come off that hill, or when you're Moses and you come with those 10 commandments of what we'll do from a security perspective, it affects the type of applications that you can have, right? But generally speaking, is it, are you a big SAP or Oracle implementation? And so we're using only SAP applications. Is it homegrown applications? Is it a mix of homegrown and third-party applications that are available to everybody? Certain risk profiles, certain companies said, we're just going to build everything. And so, we know for a shadow of a doubt that if something happens, it's on us and it's not, something that a third party could have introduced. Or, a lot of applications today use open source libraries. And so, the security posture of some organizations is, no open source. And so that really limits their ability to choose a partner to have a third party application with. So just knowing that risk profile helps to filter out how we're going to build these applications and determining the mix of them.
Would say thanks Log4j for ruining for the rest of us.
Well, it's only that specific version, but yeah, like that's a really
it's been fixed for like 3 years, and people just weren't patching.
People weren't patching. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast around.
Was that Equifax the same thing? They had like a 3-year-old unpatched.
Yep. If you're not comfortable deploying software, when something happens, it's just going to become more and more uncomfortable. So that's a muscle organizations definitely need to exercise.
Patch your software. Do it. All right. The next area we talked about was identity and identity systems, identity providers. What are the questions you'll typically ask somebody when you're giving counsel or guidance around identity provider platforms?
Yep. So we've determined the device types. We've understand the risk profile. What are the rules that are governing us? We understand how we're going to build or deliver these applications. And so, then looking at identity providers, you need to know who's going to have the features that can support those different layers that we went through. Some organizations can get really crazy with some of their setups because they'll have legacy on-prem identities or Active Directories that they're managing, but they want to also manage their devices in the cloud. But, they have Okta or Ping or what have you in the middle because, not everybody is going on-prem. Some people are on cloud. You got a mix of users. You can have corporate users. You can have consultants.
Vendors.
So just understanding who needs to do what, when, and where, and how you want to implement that helps you narrow down what identity provider you want.
Yeah, if you had to pick like the top 3 you see the most, what do those look like?
See Okta a lot, see Azure AD a lot. It's the natural transition when you have on-prem Active Directory moving towards the cloud. You see Ping Identity quite a bit. Almost always we see RSA when it comes to two-factor authentication. SailPoint is another one that we see. Don't see it that often, but we do see it with some big companies.
What about FIDO tokens? You seen those at all for identity management?
I do. A lot of your larger tech companies, definitely do that. I think FIDO tokens are starting to become more commonplace as, corporate workers aren't working like in a secure location that you badge into on a secure network. We're working from home a lot more. We're on the road a lot more, and so to support those devices, I think we're going to see a lot more of those FIDO tokens or like physical access keys that you use to help identify you.
Zero trust. I don't trust my home network. My kids are on there.
Yeah.
what are they downloading on the iPad? I don't trust it.
You don't trust your network, and your network shouldn't trust you. There you go.
I think for zero trust, you just need a poster of your kids sitting on the couch downloading stuff on your computer. Man. So the next area we talked about was the support. So the 5th area. So how do you support your devices? What do your support organization look like? For you, what are the questions you'll commonly ask folks? What are the things you're looking for when you try to use that to help guide what tools to go select? Yeah,
so it starts to lean into the standard operating procedures for an organization. So, if I'm a retailer and a hurricane comes through or somebody drives a bread truck into a power line and now my store is offline, what happens? What type of service are we going to provide? So just understanding those edge cases helps to understand, one, how we're going to build applications. I start to understand your risk profile. There's certain organizations we've worked with our BlueFletch Enterprise Launcher that, everyday scenario, I have, this type of login to get SSO, and if if I need a failover, if I need a local login, here's a redundancy path. And so, not every organization requires that or needs that, but it just depends on what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I always think it through the operational trade-off of what it costs to build that infrastructure to support offline scenarios versus online. There was a architect, I think you and I both worked with, Drew Engel, who's awesome dude, but I think he was, I just remember him preaching and saying, if this bad situation happens, you have a hurricane, we're spending X million dollars a year on backup infrastructure. Is it cheaper just to give product in the store away? And I was like, never thought of it that way. But when you start looking at operational costs versus actual infrastructure costs, there is that trade-off there. And it's really important to think about, if I'm supporting things, how do I make it the most cost-effective and still have the best customer experience? The next area we talked about was existing tooling. So what's already there? And when you start poking around and thinking, what's your existing tooling? Where does your question stack start?
Just understanding, how they're doing things today, right? A lot of these companies have been in place for a very long time, and so there's a lot of technical debt that needs to be serviced, but also may not go away. And so, understanding, what can get replaced with newer systems or newer solutions, and what can't move or what, may physically need to stay on premise just because of, going back to point, what was that, 2 with security posture. Understanding that roadmap and that landscape helps you understand, okay, how are we going to go from where we're at today to, our future more secure position. Got it.
And I guess when you're thinking about those cost benefits, do you normally recommend people rip out? And this is a pretty open question. Do you recommend they rip stuff out, or are you like one piece at a time guy? Like, how does that work for you?
It depends on the organization. Oftentimes, we can rip out systems as we go along. Usually, the hurdle is the organization's appetite for wanting to spend that money. And so, it's sometimes hard to provide an ROI in one area where, certain leadership who's approving it, may or may not care about it. So I think it just depends on the risk profile of the organization. Also depends on how much are you actually ripping out. So if you have, a very desperate organization, multiple systems, you've gotten through acquisition and it's kind of bolted on, you probably want to go one at a time just to make sure that if something does fail, that you can have redundancy or it's not going to, break the entire organization. But if everybody is in this one box and you're just going to another one, then it just makes sense to do it all at one time.
Yeah, my favorite is the company that's bought 10 other companies and has 10 different systems. And the idea of buying and acquiring and rolling these things together is to get scale from consolidating systems, and they don't do it. I'm like, you could have just left them as 10 companies. You're not making any operational improvements. So you do have to start doing it sooner or later to get your money's worth out of it. So, Rich, I appreciate you covering these for me today. The key ones, just to recap. So thinking about device types is number one, your security posture. So, if you're healthcare, HIPAA, if you're retail, PCI, if you're in California, whatever new regulation they have that week. The third one was application landscape. So are you buying apps? Are you building apps on your own? Are you, do you have legacy apps you're rolling together? The fourth one we talked about was identity management. So what is your source of truth? Do you have employees, vendors, contractors, customers? How are you managing all those identities together? The fifth area was support. So your support tooling, how you trade off uptime versus downtime, operational security versus actual technology security. And then the sixth area was existing tooling. So understanding, what your landscape looks like for your tools and your systems and how that works together, when you replace things. So, back to the original question of, what is the best security system? There is no best security system. So it is, you have to look at your situation individually and say, these are the things I need to be successful, and then make those decisions and do the trade-off of the cost benefit.
Yep, it depends, and you got to do the legwork to do the research, and don't be afraid to talk to the vendors and those companies and ask, can you talk to similar companies? the one thing that bugs me is, I get asked that question, and, an organization has spent a year, poking around a system, but hasn't talked to the company that they're poking around with, hasn't talked to other customers. And so, you can do that. It's okay.
So that's a good pointer. Ask your vendors. They will help you out. Thank you for covering this topic today. Appreciate it. And if anybody has any future topics they want us to cover, just reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com. Thank you.